Welcome to this new video of the Converse series. As always, rewatch the extract on Miku sensei's channel and add a like on her video. And this video is going to be a bit tricky. We'll finish translating the big sentence, and then in the next video we'll finish the first extract of this first video. And well, let's get started. So we've translated the first part of the sentence in the last video. So 実は actually これからインタビューする人は the person I'm going to interview now 私の先輩で is my 先輩 and then we have 私がメキシコで日本語を教えていた時の先輩です。So first what we can do is translating what we know. So we've already done it in the previous video. So 私が I メキシコで in Mexico 日本語を教えていた was teaching Japanese. So I was teaching Japanese in Mexico. But now we need to understand what is this toki after 教えていた. So for people who are observant, you might have thought that it was a relative because you have a verb right in front of something that looks like a noun, and indeed it looks like a noun since you have no after it, and basically you should always use no after a noun. And actually it's not completely wrong, it's even quite true. Yes, originally it's a relative, but it's become an expression in itself, and so when you have a verb and then toki, you can translate by when. It means when. So let's see few examples. 日本に行った時. 日本に行った I went to Japan. Toki, when. So of course, once again, it's reversed compared to English. In Japanese, toki is at the end of the clause, while in English, it's at the beginning. So you have to place when at the beginning of the clause. So 日本に行った時 when I went to Japan. Then 時間がない時. So 時間がない I don't have time. Toki, when I don't have time. And then 本を読む時 when I read a book. So it's quite easy, but you also have to remember that in Japanese, the when clause will always be at the beginning. For example, in English, you could say, I bought a camera when I went to Japan, or when I went to Japan, I bought a camera. You see, you can put the when clause whenever you want. You can place it at the beginning of the sentence or at the end of the sentence. But in Japanese, it is not possible, and this rule will apply to many, many other things. In Japanese, the main clause is always at the end. And so it means that the clause with toki will always be at the beginning. And it makes sense. Toki has to be in the middle of all of this. It would be weird to end the sentence with toki. It would be impossible. You wouldn't even be able to add, for example, the politeness. So remember that it will always be the first clause. So for example, 日本に行った時、ラーメンを食べました. When I went to Japan, I ate ramen. In English, you could say, I ate ramen when I went to Japan. It would be completely fine. But in Japanese, you can't. It has to be the first clause. Then, 時間がないときはご飯を食べません. So when I don't have time, I don't eat. And here it's just to show you that you can add wa after toki. It's possible. So wa, I've already told you, it's a very weird particle. Basically, you can place it almost whenever you want because its job is just to add some contrast effect. And so basically, you can add a contrast effect on anything. And since originally toki is indeed a noun, well, it makes sense that you can add wa after it. So in English, you can't really translate this subtle nuance, but it kind of means when I don't have time and only when I don't have time, you see, contrast effect, then I don't eat my meal. And then 本を読むとき、音楽を聴きます。When I read a book, I listen to music. And once again in English, you could say, I listen to music when I read a book. But in Japanese, you can't. And then last little thing, remember that the verb before toki has to be in plain form. So either past or present, negation, etc., whatever, but it has to be in plain form. And so indeed, originally, it's just like a relative, because toki, when it's alone, like the noun toki, means time or moment. And so literally, it would be Nihon ni itta toki, the moment I went to Japan, the time I went to Japan. And so indeed, it means when I went to Japan. You will see that Japanese grammar is quite easy because actually half of its grammar is grounded on the basic rules of Japanese. For example, you see that here, to say when, we just use a relative. So if you know the relatives, if you know how a relative works, then you can understand toki without any problem. And this is, of course, also why the verb has to be in plain form, because we've studied that with relatives, the verb had to be in plain form. So you see that all the rules that we've studied, they are here. So actually, there's nothing new here. And so we're pretty happy because we can understand the first part of it. So when I was teaching Japanese in Mexico. But the problem is that here we don't have a toki clause plus a main clause. No, we have a no. Toki no senpai desu. Toki is linked to another noun. So now let's add the end of the sentence. So no senpai desu. You then have two nouns, senpai and toki, which are connected by no. So, until now, grammatically speaking, no problem. You know that no connects two nouns together to form one noun group. So, toki no senpai has to be one noun group. You can't have no and separate the nouns. It's impossible. It's no's reason for being. It's to connect nouns together. But then, you also have the relative attached to toki. So, you can't omit it. Just as with no, you can't separate a relative from its head noun. It's always part of the same group. And it makes sense because when you say when I taught Japanese, you can't separate when from I taught Japanese. It's linked together. So it is also in the same noun phrase. It then means that this whole thing is just one single noun phrase. And so if you look closely, you notice that actually it's just a Y-des pattern. Y being, well, the big noun phrase. And so if we translate this goddamn long sentence, it's just because the grammar pattern behind it is actually very simple. It's just that you have some kind of big-ass noun phrase, you see? And so now that you've realized this, at first, what you can do is to delete all the precisions. When you have a sentence that is too big for your brain to process it, then delete the precisions, just keep the core noun. And so you have senpai desu, which is very easy to translate. Here's my senpai. And then you add the precisions one by one. So no of, toki when, and then 私がメキシコで日本語を教えていた I was teaching Japanese in Mexico. And here it is. You have your sentence. So this sentence is the reason why you have to perfectly master the basic grammar rules of Japanese. Because you see that they are always valid and they kind of underpin almost every Japanese grammar expression. For example, here, you can remember that if you need to connect two nouns, you can always use no. As long as, grammatically speaking, you have two nouns, then you can connect them with no whatever the situation is. So even if toki is used here as when, so some kind of subordinating conjunction in English, well, in Japanese, it's still a noun. Like grammatically speaking, it's still a noun. So you can add no if you need to connect it with what comes next. And this way you can make big noun phrase when you have to add tons of precisions about the head noun, the core noun. So here, she had to add the precision that her senpai, this senpai, was the senpai of when she was teaching Japanese in Mexico. So she has to connect them, so she adds no. Okay, now a little pause. We are going to study the kanji for toki. So, as I told you, toki means time, moment, period, etc., etc. So the Chinese pronunciation is ji, and the Japanese pronunciation is toki. So, as for the etymology, is actually not really the etymology because actually it's not working this way in Japan. You don't really ring the temple bells to mark the everyday flow of time, etc., etc. But so indeed, it's built out of days and a temple. And so in every temple, you have a bell, which is used to mark the everyday flow of time. And so toki is time. So just like with a church, you see, imagine a church, and then it becomes toki, the time. So since toki is a noun, of course, you can add sono or kono or ano in front of it to say at that time or at this time. And so this is the Japanese pronunciation. But then here, you see that for this kanji, the Chinese pronunciation can be used alone. Usually, you shouldn't use the Chinese pronunciation alone, but here you can more or less do it if you add a number before it. So ji is hour. So if you want to say 1 a.m. or 1 p.m., you say ichiji. Then if you want to say 3 a.m. or 3 p.m., sanji. And of course, it works for every number, rokuji, goji, shichiji, etc., etc. Then for combined kanjis, you have, for example, jikan. And so the difference with the ji is that ji is just like the hour, okay? So 1 p.m., it's like o'clock, you see? But jikan is the duration. So each jikan will be 1 hour. Nijikan will be 2 hours. When you add kan, you indicate that it's a duration. And then toki doki, so the second kanji is here when you want to repeat the kanji before, so toki doki. And then it means sometimes, and actually it's literal, from time to time, toki doki, from time to time. And so, just to show you something, let's go back to our sentence. We could have transformed this sentence, actually. She could have said all of this a way simpler way. For example, she could have just said, a few years ago, I was teaching Japanese in Mexico. Period. And then he is the senpai of that time. And that would have been then sono toki no senpai desu. Sono toki, that time, no senpai desu. He is the senpai of that time. So yeah, it would have been much simpler than having this big noun phrase. And it would have worked. And so last thing we're going to study in this video is the tense that you have on oshiete-ita. Because we didn't talk about it, but it's weird because it comes from oshieru, and yet it's become oshiete-ita, not oshieta, which would just be the past tense in plain form. It's oshiete-ita. So it's more or less the progressive tense. Teiru. When you add teiru on a verb, it's to make a progressive tense. So you have to use it either when something is currently happening, like right now, he is doing this right now, or when it's ongoing in your life. And so the teiru tense is just a te form plus iru. So the te form, we've seen it, you can use it on its own. You can use it alone and then it will connect adjectives, verbs, sentences, etc. But it's also used a lot as a base to build some other expressions, to attach some kind of suffixes. And so here, this te form is just used to attach iru and then create the teiru tense. So of course here you won't translate any te form. It's just a tense. It's not linking anything together. So let's see a few examples. So 2 examples for something that is ongoing in your life. For example, you want to say, I study Japanese. So indeed, you are already studying it, and it's ongoing in your life. So you are not going to say 勉強します. You'd rather say 勉強しています. If you said 日本語を勉強します, then in many situations it would mean I will study Japanese. Because if you don't use teiru, then it means that it's not ongoing in your life. And so it means that it's in the future since it's not ongoing in your life. So 日本語を勉強します. I will study Japanese. 日本語を勉強しています. I study Japanese. And then 東京に住んでいる. So maybe many of you know this sentence because you kind of learn it by heart at the beginning when you learn Japanese. And so this is a teiru form. The verb 住んでいる, we've seen it in another video, comes from 住む. So it's not 住みます, it's 住んでいる or 住んでいます, of course, in polite form. And indeed, you will almost never say 住みます because it's ongoing. When you live somewhere, it's ongoing. So once again, if you say 東京に住みます, it would mean, in most cases, I will live in Tokyo. But here, you already live in Tokyo. So 東京に住んでいる. And then for something that is currently happening, so here it's very simple because it's the same as the be plus ing form in English. So for example, when you say pasta o tabete imasu, I am eating pasta. Like right now, I am eating pasta. Or, for example, 先生と話しているよ. 先生と話しているよ. She's talking with the teacher. Right now, she's talking with the teacher. So we see later that the teiru tense has got some other meanings, some other uses, but for the moment you can't remember this currently happening and this ongoing in your life meaning, and it will be fine. And so, well, we've learned the te form when it's used alone. We've learned a tense based on the te form, which is teiru. So maybe it would be time to learn how to conjugate verbs into te form. But I have good news for you. The conjugation for the te form is the same as the conjugation for the past tense in plain form. It's the exact same conjugation. It's just that instead of ending with e, you end with a. So, for example, 帰って帰った 買って買った 泳いだ泳いで You see, it's the same. It's just that you have e instead of a or a instead of e. So you will learn 2 conjugations at once, and that's pretty cool. So you should know it, but just in case, know that in Japanese you have 2 groups for verbs. The first group, ichidan, the ichidan verbs, are the verbs ending with ru, like taberu, miru, okiru, etc., etc. For the ichidan verbs, they are super easy. So whatever the conjugation is, you just delete ru and you add the needed suffix. So it works with every tense. You just delete ru and you add what you need to add. So for the te form, we will just add te. So taberu, tabe, you delete ru, and then you add te. So tabete, taberu, tabe, tabete. And same for the past tense. So taberu, tabe, tabeta. And you see that it's the same as when you do a mass form. Taberu, tabe, tabemasu. It's the same, and it works the same for every tense. So pretty cool. Then the godan verbs. So the godan verbs are the other verbs, the verbs that don't end with ru, And for the godan verbs, you will have to learn the te form by heart because it's like an actual conjugation. So you will have to learn it. But by the way, be careful because godan verbs can also end with ru. So verbs ending with ru can be ichidan or can be godan. And of course, it's very important because the conjugation, the way of conjugating the verb, will completely change. And so for each verb that ends with ru, you have to learn which groups the verb is in. So when the verb is ichidan, I will add 1 after it, and when it's godan, I will add 5 after it. So for example, taberu, I would add 1 after it, but kaeru as in to go home, I would add 5 after it because it's a godan verb. And so here is the conjugation. And basically, the only thing that you have to remember is that verbs ending with tsu, u, ru becomes te. Verbs ending with mu, nu, bu becomes nde. Verbs ending with ku becomes ite, and with gu, ide. It's the same, it's just that you have tenten. And then verbs ending with su becomes shite. And that's it. And then you also have verbs that are irregular, like iku should become iite, but it's ite. Suru becomes shite and kuru becomes kite. And then for aru, iru, they're not irregular per se, but since they are so important, since you will see them all the time and they can be a bit confusing sometimes, learn them too by themselves. So aru, atte, iru, ite. And then here is the ta form, so the past tense in plain form, and you see that it's the same. Like it's the exact same conjugation. And so this is the end of the video, so good luck to remember all of this. Next video will be much easier, we won't have such long sentences, such long noun phrases, and we will finish the first extract of the first converse video. So remember that you have exercises at the end of the video, try to do them, this is very important, because if you don't practice, of course, you will lack something that is too important, you will not get used to the things that we study, so do the exercises. And of course, you have the answers at the very end of the video. So good luck with all of this and see you next video.